Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to get started now. So I'd like to start today with an acknowledgement of country. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we create and share our learning resources. We acknowledge the traditional owners as the original storytellers, teachers and students of the land we call Australia. We pay our respects to elders, past and present. We also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Today I am presenting on Wurundjeri country, part of the Kulin Nation. Hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for the last of our 4-part webinar series on applying the science of reading in your classroom. My name is Joanna Lake and I'm the Product Manager for Primary Education at Oxford University Press. Today, we will be exploring the topic of implementing impactful paired reading sessions in our classrooms. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for the webinar series, Dr. Nathaniel Swain. With expertise in language, literacy, instructional practices and cognitive science, Dr. Nathaniel Swain is dedicated to empowering teachers to develop life-changing language and literacy skills in every student through effective and engaging teaching. He is a teacher, instructional coach and writer. He produces a blog for teachers called Dr. Swain's Cognitorium and is co-host of the Chalk Dust podcast with Rebecca Birch. Having worked at universities and government school systems in Victoria, Australia, Nathaniel has taught a range of learners in schools and also in tertiary settings. Dr. Swain founded a community of teachers committed to the science of learning, Think Forward Educators, which is now 25,000 members and growing. And I'd really encourage you to check out Think Forward Educators if you haven't previously. Dr. Swain is a sought-after speaker on educational circuits and has a best-selling book entitled Harnessing the Science of Learning, Success Stories to Help Kickstart Your School Improvement. Nathaniel has also contributed as the literacy and instructional expert on Oxford's new systematic synthetic phonics program, Essential Letters and Sounds Australia. I'm really looking forward to this session today and hearing more about paired reading in the classroom. So welcome, Nathaniel, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Joanna. It's always a pleasure and very excited to participate in this final webinar in the series. So we're going to talk about impactful paired reading sessions and really talk to you about fluency in general and link that with all of the previous learning in these webinars. If this is the first of the ones that you're tuning into, there's certainly a reason to go back and listen to all those other professional learning opportunities. They are available on the Oxford University Press website as well as on YouTube. So let's jump into it. So a little review from last time. What models explain how reading is mastered? And this question from last time as well, what is retrieval practice? Let's remind ourselves. So children become competent readers using the following main processes. The first one is orthographic mapping. That's the ability to map the graphemes to the phonemes, so the letter sounds to the sounds that, getting my words confused today. The letters with the sounds is what I'm trying to say. And then connecting those into words in order to find the meaning of what those words are. And that's initially a very slow and labored process. But orthographic mapping shows that when students do this process of decoding and spelling enough, eventually it becomes automatic. And that is the really cool thing to see students going very, very slowly through decoding and trying to pull the sounds together and blending to then being actually very fluent. And that's a really wonderful thing to see as a first, if you're a kindergarten or a foundation or a prep teacher, it is very satisfying to see your students progress in that way. One of the other ways that students become competent readers is by self-teaching. So the self-teaching hypothesis we looked at last time, and this is the idea that we actually can't teach students to read every single word. So there has to be an element of them teaching themselves. And this is exactly what has been proposed by David Scher, and his self-teaching hypothesis says that once decoding connected text independently, students begin to generalize these abilities to novel words. And that is one of the reasons why we want them to be reading text and wanting them to apply their phonics skills, not just in single word experiences or sentence experiences, but in whole text experiences as well. As this is when they can start to get an insight into whether they're understanding what the words are, figuring out what they are saying, and then hopefully making it easy for them to understand those words as well. So David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis helps explain why giving students access to rich text and giving them access to decodable text in the initial stages is really important. Also, don't forget about forgetting. Last time we looked at the forgetting curve and how just because you've taught something once doesn't mean that it's taught forever. So that's a little reminder for that, that you need to be including lots of review, which is why ELSA does have a lot of review built into it. Every lesson begins with a review and ends with a review, which is really fantastic. And a daily review in this program or in any part of your curriculum really should be fast-paced, a warm-up. It should require students to recall previously learned information. It shouldn't involve any new learning, ideally, but if it does, you can either fix it quickly or make a note and come back to it as a proper catch-up or reteach lesson. And ideally, you do this whole class as well so that it's really, really fast. The other tiny bit of review here of our learning that we've done before we launch into fluency is just the idea of engagement norms, mainly because engagement norms are also a great opportunity for students to practice fluent reading or tracking fluent reading. So you've got your pair shares and your whiteboards, which I'm hoping you're using frequently in your practice, but you also have opportunities to get students to track with you. That means to use their eyes to track what you're reading from the screen or from a book, for example. You can also do a little bit of choral reading, so getting students to read together. And to do this well, we essentially want to think of the teacher as being like the engine pulling everyone along. So pointing with your finger or maybe a pointing stick, if your arm's not long enough, like mine is wanting to be a bit longer on some of those big screens, or a laser if you have a kind of whiteboard or projector where you can use a laser. Obviously, having something to aim for is really important for students so that we can stay in sync. If it's going to be fluent practice of reading, it has to be in synchrony, and that's really important. These little engagement norms are actually these incremental and day-by-day, session-by-session opportunities to get a little bit of reading fluency or hearing of fluent reading happening. Now, I've sort of warmed you up and I've talked about previous learning, but now I really want to dive into where is fluency in the models that we've looked at so far. And so to do that, let's look a little bit at the simple view of reading. So the simple view of reading, we haven't actually looked at this series, but it's been underlying a lot of our work, mainly because we've been focusing a lot on the decoding side of this equation. Equally as important is the language comprehension side. And these two factors together, when multiplied, basically can predict the reading comprehension of our students. So the formula states that reading comprehension is the product, not the sum. So it actually has to be multiplied, which means any number multiplied by 0 is 0. So you can't compensate for one side of the equation with the other. We need to have both of these really strong. So it's decoding and reading on one side and understanding the words in isolation and in the context of the text on the other side. Now, the simple view of reading doesn't actually have a spot for fluency. So we need to expand this out a little bit. And one way to do that is to talk about the 5 or 6 keys to reading, where fluency is definitely one of them, or we can use the reading rope. So let's expand it out a little bit and look at the reading rope. So here we go, fancy animation, just a little bonus there. Essentially, we've got word recognition or decoding in the blue here, and then we've got language comprehension up here in the red. And these are tightly woven together in order to give us skilled reading or reading comprehension. Now, in Scarborough's reading rope model, you'll see that over time, the word recognition becomes increasingly automatic. So all of that work to get words read correctly, to get the sounds working, to decode each word, and then to eventually recognize words by sight through that orthographic mapping, eventually means that we don't have to think about decoding so much anymore. It just happens by itself. On the top of the strands, the red, these increasingly become strategic. So that means we use our language skills to know how to read fluently and to understand what we're reading. So things like background knowledge, vocabulary, the syntax or language structures, the verbal reasoning like inference and metaphor, and the literacy knowledge like print awareness and genre sort of knowledge as well. So all of that is woven together into a really, really nice description here, which is fluent execution and coordination of language comprehension and word recognition. And so some people have said in this model, the best place to conceive of fluency, which is the topic of today, is right here in the center. is that it's the combination of decoding coming from the bottom part of the rope to the top part of the rope being much more strategic, the language comprehension. So fluency is basically that combination there, and it does rely, to be a really fluent and expressive reader, it does rely on students being able to understand the syntax and understand the vocabulary as well, to understand where we should be pausing, how we should provide emphasis, and so on. But it equally is just as important to get students getting those decoding and orthographic recognition skills happening as well. So that is a little overview of where fluency might be. Let's just talk about it more in a little bit more detail. Essentially, fluency is, if you haven't thought of it as an aspect of your practice before, maybe in other times before phonics or the structure literacy block wasn't a part of your practice, you might have thought, oh, I haven't really thought about fluency that much. I've been focusing more on the MSV or guided reading, for example. Essentially, fluency is a really important outcome because it's an accurate predictor of our comprehension skills. So how fluently, I should say, students read is a fairly reliable predictor of how well students will comprehend. Now, this might seem a little bit strange. It's like, how is it possible that students will be able to show us how they'll comprehend by the way in which they're the way in which they're fluently reading? Well, the way that is possible is because fluency is half of the equation in terms of how well students are going to comprehend, remembering it's half of the reading rope. So if students are disfluent, if they're slow, if they're inaccurate, if they're not expressive, it shows us quite a bit about the decoding, but also gives us a little hint here. Remember, it's increasingly strategic. It gives us a hint here about what they're understanding as they're reading as well. So fluency is an outcome of these two areas, but it's also a focus of our instruction and something that we need to build lots of time for practice at home, but within our lessons and within the course of the week as well. So here's some new learning for you, which hasn't been covered in this series so far, which is looking at different kinds of text, including decodable text. As a bit of a warm-up to the chat or to the responses in the Q&A, I'd love to hear from you what kinds of texts are your students reading. Now, it could be any kinds of text, not just decodables. What kinds of text are they reading, and what kinds of text are they having read to them? Depending on your year levels. So just put a few responses in the chat just to warm it up a little bit. So Anna is saying reading decodables and free choice books being read to with trade books as well. So chapter books or non-fiction books, for example, and what year level I wonder Anna is. So that might help us understand, maybe one or two, I'm guessing. Kate is saying year 4, so novels, The Boy at the Back of the Class, Roald Dahl, for example. We've got decodables as well as rich text, decodables, picture storybooks, and readers' theatre. Decodables in alignment with their code, scope and sequence. Adults read high quality, mainly picture text across a wide range of topics. Dandelion decodables. We've got book study books, so not class novels. We've also got decodables for fluency practice, then authentic text during curriculum, dialogic reading, so different text for the comprehension part. And what's really good about ELSA is that there's a big focus on decodable text, because this is a program from F to 2 or K to 2 that is looking really at getting fluent reading and accurate spelling and accurate word recognition. And there's a really big note in the materials, if you've ever looked at this program before, or if you're a current user, where it says that, of course, there'll be other texts that will be read to students, and that's really important for comprehension and vocabulary reasons. But it's good to hear what kinds of text people are using. Okay, thank you. That's great. We've definitely warmed up the chat now, which is fantastic. So let's talk about decodable books first. So in case this is newer to you or you haven't used them as much in your practice and you're not quite sure, essentially decodable books are books designed to practice decoding skills at one layer of difficulty at a time. So a set of decodables that have been designed really well, like the ones that are used in ELSA, essentially introduce an extra layer of difficulty with each set or each level of books that come through. So rather rather than saying, okay, I hope that you can cope with all this complexity and throwing the students all in the deep end, it actually gradually increases in a very, very gentle way into different levels of complexity. And that usually aligns very strongly in most programs, including ELSA, with the scope and sequence of how sounds and also hard to read and spell words are introduced in the sequence. So this is great because it aligns beautifully with what you're teaching. And for those students who might be powering ahead and ready for another challenge, they're essentially getting a little preview of what's also coming up in the main phonics or spelling lessons, which is great. So they're essentially like training wheels until students are ready for more uncontrolled books. And remembering back to the start of this series, we talked about the importance of giving students access to lots of different kinds of text so that they see words that don't just fit the pattern, but also break the pattern, because English is so interesting like that. But essentially, decodables allow students to be successful at this kind of reading for independent and for shared reading. And other kinds of text that they would be exposed to would not necessarily be attempted independently, mainly because we don't want to encourage students to guess. We want them to feel successful, and that when they are exposed to other words, they're essentially supported, or that those words are explained, or there's more sort of guidance available to them, which is why decodables are so perfect for students when they're first learning to read. Tiny little anecdote here. My 5-year-old, my daughter's starting school next year. As you can imagine, in a household like mine, we're already reading a whole lot of books. But what she's loving at the moment is that the decodable books that she's reading for fun at this point, I'm not that kind of parent, don't worry. The books that she's reading for fun are actually very, very gentle and just introduce a tiny bit more complexity each time. And we'll look at a few examples, and I'll do an imitation of how she's reading at this point, having just turned 5, which many students at the start of school have only just turned 5 there as well. So it's probably a good sample. Just a little note here, for paired and independent reading, students may well be further ahead or on an earlier level to what the class is doing for the main phonics lesson. So basically giving them access to the independent text or shared text at their level when they're doing that part of the lesson is actually a really good example of differentiation. Some students won't be ready for the matching text that goes with the phonics lesson that the whole class is up to. Maybe they're still consolidating a few levels back. And that's actually really good to not just power ahead, to actually wait until they're ready to move on and get that mastery. If they are stumbling their way through the text and it's way too hard, we've defeated the purpose of doing fluency practice at a text level. If it's not accessible at all, and in the ELSA guidance, it says don't introduce the decodable text until you get students at least reading the CVC words that are in that text in a singular sort of fashion, because it is a lot of overwhelm otherwise. But on the other end, you may have students that are further ahead. Maybe they're already a bit more confident with a few other sounds and can handle a bit more complexity. I have seen some people wanting to hold students back until you've taught that example lesson, but ideally you allow them to progress through and experience more challenge as they go through, as long as you explain what those new patterns or ideas might be in the next level up. If you make a mistake and you put them up too high, you can always bring them back down. And that's then therefore responsive to what the students are ready for and what they're doing. So in terms of the kinds of books that are available through ELSA, these ones are aligned with letters and sounds, as well as the ELSA Australia progression. So these readers ensure that students are introduced to decodable books that align with those programs. And each week there's different focus GPCs or codes that appear multiple times. So this is really handy because you get lots of repeated practice with the same codes. And ideally, all of that reading fluency is heavily reinforcing all the great work that you're doing in the classroom. So each week, each week's harder to read and spell words actually appear multiple times as well. So just a reminder, these are the irregular words that have to be explained and don't have a phonics pattern that can be easy to pronounce them. So we have to just say how they're pronounced and give the letters to practice spelling them. These ones appear many times as well, so that students are seeing these new words multiple times and can also map them as an irregular word. And then students can take in what they've learned from their lessons and apply it immediately. And if your phonics program doesn't do that, or if you're not using decodable readers to that same degree, these are some really good principles to work from in terms of making sure that your phonics practice, the phonics lesson, is really reinforced by the fluency practice. What's really great about this series as well, because I'm always on the hunt for more decodable readers because my kids are voracious and ready to do more. One of my kids, who's a few years older, he's finished with decodables now and is now in that in-between stage where he can't quite handle really long books, but needs those shorter chapter books. And I've been very lucky to get access to quite a few examples that publishers have to fill that gap in the market. However, my daughter is definitely at the stage where these 91 engaging books would be really helpful for her because she's always looking for the next story, the next idea, even though she might still be needing some more practice because she's not yet started school. So these readers are designed to ensure that students can apply their phonic knowledge in a rich and authentic reading experience, not just single words, but a whole text. And they actually reduce the cognitive load because the fonts and the page layouts are very well put together. And this is important so that the text feel and look good and make it easy for students to focus on what's important. This is really nice. They expose progressively complex genres, characters, themes, and plots, and they can build reading confidence over time. And Maddie's just asked, this might be a good one for Joanna or the team. Can you please share the ELSA reception code sequence so I can see if it's appropriate for our learners? So I think we could link that in the chat or something like that to see if it might be something you're interested in. So in terms of alignment with the curriculum, Joanna, did you want to speak there? No.
Yes, Maddie, we can certainly get that to you so you can have a look. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. So in terms of the alignment with the curriculum as well, these readers are also fantastic for the standards that are required to be taught in either the Victorian curriculum or the Australian curriculum. And I'm guessing the New South Wales syllabus as well, which is rather new. There's so much alignment that's had to happen in order to align with all the new sort of requirements. So getting lots of practice with phonic knowledge, with text fluency, actually monitoring meaning and comprehension strategies are embedded, which ideally every decodable that you pick up, whether it's from this program or another one, will have some lovely comprehension questions that get the student to think back to what they've read. Because if you're getting students racing and trying to get to the end of the book just as quickly as they can, they're not reading ideally. They need to be going back and really reading for meaning, not just for speed. Text structure and organization can also be a focus using these texts, as well as understanding the use of punctuation. Love talking about quotation marks or question marks or exclamation marks are a big favorite with my daughter at the moment. Just yesterday, she was reading the word run, and it was R-U-U-U-U-U-U-N, like a really big sort of run. And she said it so fluently that I thought she was calling out mum. But then she was like, no, I'm just reading. I'm doing what the punctuation says. So I think when students really appreciate punctuation, it can be really lovely. Developing vocabulary as well, because just because it's decodable doesn't mean it can't have some lovely words in it. Sometimes there are additional words that are harder to read and spell that'll be explained at the front of the book because they just, the publisher says we have to have this word for this story. And I think that's really sensible. So a few other ideas. So these phonic readers, like a few others, but there's some unique features here, apply and demonstrate mastery of phonic knowledge at the point of learning. So ideally, this is exactly where the student needs to be practicing. And if you're following the sequence through, and if they're moving up according to proficiency on the different levels, they can then experience the next level of challenge, but not too much challenge, which I think is really great. Some sequences probably jump up or jump down up too slowly or too quickly, which means that students either feel like they're stuck or they feel like there's too big a leap ahead, in which case they can't progress because they haven't quite mastered whatever they're missing to get to that next level. So I think having a sliding gradient like this is really helpful. And then practicing and retrieving phonic knowledge at regular intervals. So essentially, it's not just the focus grapheme for that reader, it's all the previous readers and all the previous sounds and hard to read and spell words that are actually brought in. And that in that way, they review and consolidate phonic knowledge. So talking a little bit more about decodable text, in case these are newer to you, basically they may also have irregular words, as we've said, and these harder to read or spell words are read as per the practice in the section of the reading and spelling lesson. So if you're reading it with a student and they come to this word and they try and phonically decode it, we can just treat them as we would a hard to read and spell word in a regular phonics lesson and just provide the pronunciation or explain the bit that's tricky. So aim for decoding where possible, and eventually students can recognize these words automatically. So I know "the" took a long time for my daughter. She was really adamant to go "t" and "h," but we just eventually got to that. And it doesn't help that the TH in the is really hard to pronounce. So she still says d, like a d sort of sound instead of the, because she's still learning that thing. And if I had my speechy hat on, I would reassure you that the TH sound is not usually mastered until 7 or 8. So it's okay for 5 and 6 year olds to still struggle with the pronunciation of the. You might get va, you might get da, as my daughter's doing, or you might get a mix of the two, for example. So just another thing you can do with all of your readers, and I think this is depending on whatever program you're using, this is really important principles before and after reading support for this process. The pinnacle, if you like, is what we're doing in the reading of the decodable, but what we're doing before and after is really important. So phonic readers such as ELSA provide that before reading support, and students engage in targeted practice of those sounds and words along with vocabulary checks. So if we zoom in here, there's a chance for them to practice these sounds and just get them fresh in their mind, practice those sounds in some words, get some blending and segmenting sort of happening, and then find those trickier words that might be there as well to get them prepped. They can also talk through any vocabulary that's about to appear. And it's nice in terms of getting parents reading with or families reading with students at home. It's really important that they actually have conversations about the words that are appearing and not just treating the reading process as just a tick and flick sort of activity. They've also got some comprehension questions which are here as well, which is really nice. And I think most decodables should have that. And if they don't, they really need to. After reading support is there as well. So students complete end of book reviews and answer those questions. And that helps them build skills in a lot of different areas. Because as I said before, it's not just about going through the motions of getting the words right. You do want to do some light touch comprehension, knowing that, yes, these aren't the richest literature because they're like training wheels, but there's still an opportunity to build meaning. And more in the last 10 years or 5 years especially, the quality of the decodable texts have been increasing incredibly, so that they're not just very, very formulaic. They're actually quite lovely books to read and very enjoyable as well. I think that's a really good mix of things. So a little review from one of our previous sessions, in case you remember, just a reminder about hard to read and spell words. Ideally, you try and decode or spell the parts you can using your phonics and just highlight the part that's a little bit hard. So some words in the decodable are not irregular, but might be later in the sequence, for example. So if you can decode them, just decode them and point out the part of the word that's new or unexpected. For example, this is taken from one of the ELSA decodables. There's the sounds that we're going to expect, but here's some high frequency words. Maybe the O hasn't been, it has, maybe the N hasn't been looked at recently. The C is here, yes it is, but the G, no, that's fine. So sometimes there'll be a word like dad, for example, and D hasn't been introduced yet, but we just really needed that D for dad. So it will appear here in the high frequency words. And if we need to, just explain the part that's more tricky or allow them to get that practice. In case you're wondering, in the sequence in ELSA, there's essentially this very rapid introduction, if you like. Some phonics programs take a really long time to introduce sounds. What I love about this sequence is that it's rapidly introducing quite a few sounds so that we've got some to play with. And because there's so much review built into this sequence, it means that students are getting lots of practice and they're going back over this previous sounds many times. But by the end of week 5, we've got quite a few sounds to play with. So that's 4, 8, 12, 15, and then 16 with this double S. We can make quite a few lovely words and we can read some decent little texts if we want to, even if it's just short sentences or a few sentences come together. So this is really nice. Some sequences, I have to say, probably don't introduce enough complexity early enough. And as a result, you spend the whole term of term 1 in the first year of school essentially just doing sound work rather than getting the letters out. And I think we need to get the letters out straight away because they are such a useful anchor. Later on, obviously, this is a preview from year 2. We get lots of more unusual or more tricky patterns, as well as some nice things like homophones, some suffixes and prefixes, and then some nice spelling patterns as well. And you know how I always like, if you've seen me present before, I always like to talk about orthographic patterns and how it's not just all about phonology. So, changing Y to I, when do we put the Y on the end versus the I in the middle, for example. All those little things that are so helpful for spelling as well as for reading. So a little look inside. These readers progress really nicely. I've got a little progression that I'll work you through in just a moment. But ideally, as you can see, it's showing the kinds of features that we've already talked about, including fiction and non-fiction, which I think is really nice. So let me just flip across to here to show you a few examples. This is one of the very early ones that you would see in the sequence. And so a dog can, in the front cover, we have our sounds and then some high frequency words like we looked at before. I love this. This looks exactly like my dog who's in another room at the moment because once he barked during one of these webinars. And they're very manageable sized sentences that build up over time with a real focus on getting the words right and getting that practice that we want, but nice engaging sort of features like that. Then these little sentences are doable, but they also have a lot of those high frequency or hard to read and spell words that we need them to be practicing a lot, like is, for example, and on, which is later in the sequence, and so on and so forth. So what's really lovely about these is that they're doable, they feel enjoyable to read, but they're giving the right level of practice. And you've got your comprehension opportunities at the back here, before, during, and after reading, which is really nice. Let me just look at another one. A little bit later, we're just going to see some other features here to make. Oh, here's the one with dad that I was thinking of before. So we've got a few little words and then a few sentences. And then this is a mix of glossary items or captions versus sentences, which is like almost like a little procedural that we're doing here about making banana bread, it looks like, which that's much nicer than my banana bread looks, by the way. And other things as well. It looks like I don't even know what that is. That looks beautiful. A hot cross bun or something like that. So lots of very engaging images, I think, is really important because you want students not to just be going through the motions of getting the words right and wondering why they've read this book. I think that the imagery and the interest that is built by the satisfaction of reading books with really authentic images is sort of built in, which is awesome. And then you've got some comprehension questions. And let's just ramp it up again. We'll go to the buzzing bee now, which is a little bit later in the sequence. We're looking here and we've got quite a lot of complexity. And what I really love is counteracting that stereotype of decodable books are too simple or too simplistic and don't have interesting stories or interesting syntax in them. And these obviously just get more and more complex, longer sentences, more and more interesting suffixes and prefixes and so on, and just mean that you've got opportunities to keep building language and orthographic or spelling complexity, which is really nice. So this character here looks like he's going to regret all of the nasty facial expressions he made. So hopefully that's the end of that story. And then the final one here I'll show you is a little bit later. I think this is from year 1. And we've got quite complicated words, which is what's exciting. You see that progression happening. Complicated mixes of sounds as well, which I really like. For some reason, in some phonics sequences, they like to pretend that there's only one sound or one phoneme which is in focus, which I think is unwieldy, but also quite impractical, because ideally, instead of thinking of just one thing at a time, we're hoping to keep building up students' familiarity. So you might have 2 or 3 to begin with, but then you keep adding more graphemes over time. The familiar ones won't draw that much attention because they're familiar. The ones that are new are the ones that we'll focus on. But over time, our stories get richer and more interesting, which is really nice. You can see here we've got actually multisyllabic words. We've got some prose. We've got some nice punctuation, for example, and also a nice storyline that looks like is happening as well, which is great. But what they've done here, which is clever, which is different to your old level texts, which are more about just sentence length or sentence complexity or predictability, which is how previous non-decodable texts might have been put together, is that these are decodable words because they've been introduced to these spelling patterns before, and this is a chance to consolidate and practice, which is really nice. So yeah, I definitely want to read this one. Makes me want to go and read this tonight when the kids get home. They're at the grandparents tonight, so they don't cause a fuss in the background. A lot of oversharing tonight, potentially. But here we go. So lots of opportunities at the end to go back and identify different things. So this one's as a fun hunt, and there's clues hidden in the book. So what a lovely feature to have a reason to go back and reread it again and find out that information, which is really nice. So that's a little preview, and I'm obsessed with decodables. I have something like 500 or 1,000 different decodables at home from a range of different sequences, and I love seeing new ones like this as well because it makes it more interesting interesting for the skills that you're trying to reinforce and practice with your students or with your own children, for example. So let's have a look. Just a little thing that I've noticed, and like a little suggestion to make your work even better. And these are hopefully not coming across as passive aggressive, but they really are designed to try and draw attention to things that I think we could do even better in our general practice, whether you're using this program or another. So sometimes I think some teachers are thinking we have to keep them on easier decodable text for longer, either because they haven't done that level yet or because we just want to hold them there for a bit longer. Maybe they haven't got the comprehension questions right, for example. But remember, the decodable text is not necessarily the time when we develop students' comprehension. Yes, we can build it, and yes, we can reinforce it, so they're not just speed reading, but ideally, we're actually building vocabulary and comprehension in other reading experiences, read alouds, for example. So I wouldn't ever use the comprehension questions as a reason to hold them back really, really strongly if, for example, they got every single word right. I would say to the student, let's go back and really try and understand the meaning. But if they're ready for more challenge in another level up, I would try them on another level up and see how they go. If they fall apart and they really can't handle the complexity, obviously bring them back down. But I have seen examples where students are stuck on the same level for 6 months because they just can't get one of those questions right. And I think, or maybe they get one or two wrong, for example. I think it's really important that we do allow them to experience another level of challenge. And if there are persistent comprehension difficulties, we actually deal with that elsewhere. It's not the job of the decodable to address comprehension issues. It's the job of the decodable to get good at fluent reading for meaning, which is not necessarily the same thing. So my suggestion is if they can handle the next level up, move them up. And I hope that's not too controversial. All right, looking at shared text now. So this is a contrast to decodables. These are going to be uncontrolled texts. The reason I'm showing you is because you may be doing fluency with your students for a long time, way past the use of decodable text, and shared reading fluency is something that you can do at any age. So it's still important to give them access to these shared texts even when they're still doing decodables through read alouds. So it should be read aloud by the teacher or an adult and should have rich vocabulary, syntax, characters, and stories. And in the examples that people shared before, it might be picture books, it might be trade books, it might be short stories or poems, it might be non-fiction books or passages, it might be knowledge-rich units that you're reading on different topics about the world, for example. These texts are not constrained by decodability because they're not designed for students to be decoding independently. They're going to be supported in that work. They're designed to have an engaging story and to be really rich vocabulary and comprehension. Sometimes a word isn't hard to say or hard to understand because of the comprehension. It's just really hard to decode or to spell. And so these kinds of uncontrolled texts are still important to give students access to. So some things I've noticed is that maybe in some classrooms there's only exposure to decodable text and then we're avoiding uncontrolled text whatsoever. And I've even seen some lessons where they use only a decodable for all of their comprehension work. So modeling a read aloud with a comprehension decodable text and hoping that we can analyze the characters and so on in the decodable. I wouldn't use decodables to that degree. Usually we do want them reading for meaning, but we want them practicing analyzing character and story and recount and those really big picture comprehension skills on uncontrolled text, because that's what those texts are for. So my suggestion is ensure that your students get exposure through shared reading to all kinds of words and to all kinds of texts. And if you have students like mine, my own first year of school, so prep or kindergarten, I had some students in halfway through term 3 or term 4, not to try and show off or anything, who were finished with decodables. They'd worked through all the year 1 decodables. They weren't year 2 decodables. They essentially moved on to short little chapter books or short passages or little picture books, for example, that they could handle. They were ready for uncontrolled text. And you've got to be following what your students are ready for rather than feeling like you have to hold them back. So as soon as your students are ready, you can, and you've progressed through the first year of school and the grade 1 equivalent decodables, go to the next level of challenge. Some publishers are releasing short chapter books or short engaging texts that are beyond decodables or more complex than decodables. And these are a really great place to go next. All right, now that we've done that, and if you do have any questions at this point, feel free to ask them. I'm going to talk through some of the paired reading fluency routines and basically make sure we've got some time for questions at the end as well. So paired reading fluency, I've written about this before in a little blog post called Paired Fluency Reading. And this blog post is quite popular, I think, because people Google that term and then they find that blog post. So if you want to have a look at step-by-step how I like to do things, you feel free to read that in full. I'm going to give you some highlights today and give you two different versions of paired reading that you could use. One is the one that ELSA recommends for its decodables, and the other is one that you could use with any text. And it's with a 1 minute each sort of practice. So let's have a look. So in this sort of procedure, essentially what we do is we have about a minute where you get students to set up for the session, where everyone makes sure that they know who their partner is, they find the book that they're going to read or books if they need multiples. They will sit side by side, they'll figure out who's going to go first, and then it's all very smooth. And you can do this within a minute, but you first have to invest in that routine so that you know the students know what to be expected. So pairs of students can be revealed. Ideally, you ensure that they're on a similar or the same level, because otherwise you've got too big a difference between their highest and lowest sort of students, or they're on a completely different level. One for one, it's too hard, and for the other, it's too easy. So the reason I say pairs of students are revealed is because you might need to change this fairly regularly based on how students are progressing through their reading, or based on who's away that day. And ideally, you don't have to spend that first 3 or 4 minutes of paired fluency reading actually trying to figure out who's meant to be going with whom. So just decide. I usually have names on magnetic little whiteboard markers, or magnetic sort of names of these kids in the class, and I move them around and repartner them whenever needed. And this is particular partners that might be different to their turn and talk partners or their table partners. These are just their paired fluency reading partners, which are on the same level of decoding, which is really important. Do try and change pairs fairly regularly, not necessarily every day, but maybe every week, just so students get a chance to read with different people. And if you do have two students that aren't as good working together, then it's not sort of problematic for a long time. Then you just sort of swap them out if it's not quite working out because of behavior reasons and so on. Ideally, avoid arguments about where to sit. Say to one of them, if you're on the left side of your partner today, you get to decide where in the room you're going to sit. So find a comfy spot, or a spot at the table, or a chair, for example. And you don't want to lose a few minutes arguing about whose seat is whose. I put that there as a former prep teacher and knowing that was a big thing sometimes. Ensure students have sufficient reading material. Ideally, you don't have them getting up in the middle of paired fluency reading as a 10 or 15 minute routine and looking for the next book, because that can just eat up the rest of the time. So if they are fast readers and if they have read it twice and you know that they're going to move on to another book, ideally they've just got a few extra books or a few extra passages or text ready to go. Ensure they know who will start first. So just decide who that is, so there's no arguments about that as well. And then, as you can see, there's quite a lot involved for this first minute. You need to invest in the routine. So it might not be very fast to begin with, and it might be quite involved in the first few times that you run this. But if you teach and practice and rehearse those routines and give some incentives for getting really on top of things, you can make it a really smooth routine. This used to be my favorite part of the literacy block, because I'd put on this part of the block, they'd say the expectations, they'd start reading, and it was just really, really smooth. So I could go and listen to some reading. I could do some small group instruction if I wanted to. I could catch up with some other readers in this time and listen to how they're progressing. I could do some progress monitoring. This was 10 or 15 minutes that I could just bank on as being quite enjoyable and not requiring me to stand at the front of the room, which for the most of the literacy block was the case. So here's another paired fluency routine. I've called it Part 2A. This is how it might work. So that's just the setup. And then Part A I've got here. And then Part B is another way of doing it. So this is the one that ELSA uses. So pairs sit together with one student reading aloud while the other one tracks along with their finger. So one read through for decoding. So they read it all the way through that page or the paragraph, and then do another read through for fluency, so more fluently, and then a final read through for expression and voice. I quite like this because repeated reading is a really powerful practice that is found in the research to be helpful. And this allows students to get some multiple exposures and allows the other student to essentially track along with their finger in order to support and give feedback if necessary. So this incidental peer-to-peer support can be great. Ideally, the student just doesn't blurt out the word if their partner's got it wrong. Ideally, they just hold their finger or go back to that word if there was a mistake. Some students will be able to do this. I'm talking 5 and 6 year olds. Older students should definitely be able to do this if you teach it to them, because then that's really helpful for that student not to just be given the answer, but to be given a chance to self-correct if they can. Swap partners after each page or after each paragraph, or maybe after a double spread, however much it sort of seems logical to you. And then at the end, check in and wrap up for 1 or 2 minutes, where you can encourage students to give some brief, positive and constructive feedback with their partners, and make sure that's meaningful and doesn't become tokenistic. If you find that the feedback is just pretty run of the mill and sort of please get the words right, for example, you might not want to run the feedback every single time. You might do it every second time so that it's not going through the motions. So in terms of how ELSA talks about this, they follow a carefully designed structure, providing students with clear guidance and consistent support. The model reading comes first, and then this pair practice routine that I just talked about is what happens next. And then there's 3 reading opportunities for each of those pages. So the first to focus on decoding, then practice and for fluency, and then some expression and intonation, which we know isn't just about decoding, is also about comprehension. So if you have students that struggle with the expression, it might not be all about decoding. It may be that they're getting the words right. They just don't know how the syntax or the vocabulary or the punctuation is meant to be working, which is okay. So that's part A, if you like. That's one version of the end of this routine. The setup is the same, so the same setup, but here's another way that you could do it, and this involves potentially any text that they read together. So this one here is the paired fluency reading number B, and here pairs sit together with one student reading aloud while the other one listens. They could be tracking with their finger, or they could just listen. You start an automatic timer. I've got a little PowerPoint to show you, or an equivalent. This blog post here also has an automatic timer PowerPoint if you wanted to see what that looks like as another option. Ideally, you avoid manual timing. So sometimes you do 1 minute each, but the teacher has to manually time it. Essentially, you miss out on the bonus 10 minutes in your day to do all kinds of different things if you have to time and tell them when to swap. So an automatic timer is a lot more powerful. After 1 minute of fluent reading, a bell signals the change of roles and the listener becomes the reader. And this is important, picking up where the other left off. Otherwise, you get students starting again from the beginning of the text and just reading the same segment again and again and never getting all the way through. So picking up where the other left off is also a reason for the person who's listening to be listening carefully, because then they'll know where to continue. Give some incidental peer-to-peer support like we've talked about, and then do the same feedback session. So to show you what it looks like, this is the automatic timer, alternating 1 minute each. You could change this on the PowerPoint. This is definitely swappable or editable if you'd like, but we're aiming for speed as well as prosody, so that idea of fluent and expressive reading. And it looks a little bit like this. I don't know if the sound is going to come through, but essentially there's a little sound that goes off. I don't know if that was loud enough. So a little sound that goes off that says time to read. I don't know if you can hear that. There we go. You probably heard it that time. And so it's actually a cash register sound. So when my friend Shane Pearson and I put these together, we didn't have a nice ding. We just had a cash register. So you have to cash in on all that great reading that you're doing with your students. Such a terrible joke. Over time, these little things pop up by themselves. So 1 minute's gone past, it's 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. And then when the time is up, whether it's 8 or you might make it 15 if you want to edit this, then a little beat the bomb sort of appears saying time's up, which is kind of cute, and it just is something that's really easy to put on. So I used to put this on and then wander around the room, and those 10 minutes would go so smoothly because everyone would be reading, listening, practicing, going back and forth. And it's a nice little variation and does work well even if you're reading passages, or if you're reading free choice text, or if you're reading older sort of books as well for fluency as well. So a few little things that I've noticed, and then we're going to start wrapping up because we just need to get some time for questions. Some few little things I've noticed is that sometimes students will spend too long on the same book and therefore memorize the text. And this is not ideal because the game of decoding or fluency is not a memorization game. It's a fluent recognition game, which is not exactly the same thing. So ideally, they don't recognize and memorize the whole story. Instead, they're trying to decode and automatically recognize the words, which means variety can be your friend. So strike the balance between repeated readings, which can be beneficial, as I've said, and also some variety, which is important for getting practice on different kinds of words. So you can interleave the books that you read and go back and forth between different books and repeat them again, but after a short break, for example. Another thing I've noticed is that problem we talked about before, not enough reading material, and they go and waste their time going and getting new books. Ideally, ensures that students have enough to read between them. Don't lose time as students go and retrieve more books or passages. And now to finish, I've just got a little pitch here for you. This is my prose pitch, because there's many free choice books that students can read that don't actually meet the criteria for being something that's useful for practicing reading fluency on. That's because prose is not the only form of book that's out there, and probably not marketed at the moment by a lot of trade publishers as the most engaging form of text, even though prose is incredibly important for developing comprehension and reading fluency. So after decodables, why would you do prose text? Mainly because it's got the language and syntax that you don't hear anywhere else. Prose is the only time you hear academic language coming through, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. So really important. So if you have got reading fluency on some disjointed or choppy text, or primarily visual text or graphic novels, here are my suggestions. These texts aren't really suitable for reading fluency practice. Try to spotlight the importance of prose with books or passages linked to the curriculum or free choice, but having nice connected sentences with or without dialogue, with longer sentence structures, and not necessarily just back and forth between different characters like a movie script. So there's nothing wrong with those texts. It's just that they don't have the same benefits that prose does. So here's my little pitch for prose. Tiny little note, and then I'll throw to Joanna. Some home reading routines are really important to embed. Ideally, consider the benefits of paper versus online books. Obviously, depending on your budgets, it might only be online and you have access at home. But if there's room in the budget, it can be really useful for having some paper books that go home, some traditional sort of decodables in your hand that allow students to see and feel the books as well, and just to get them off the screen for another part of the day. So do consider that, and try and have a system where they can take books home and then bring them back the next day and swap them if they would like, because that would be more variety and more motivation to keep reading every night because it's a different book. Ideally, children are reading 5 or 6 times per week in addition to the times at school, and make this achievable by reminding families that even short amounts of practice more frequently is much more effective than long bouts of practice infrequently. That should be one word. Thank you so much. I'm going to throw over to Joanna now. That's my main messages, and then we're going to do some questions after that.
Great. Thanks so much, Nathaniel. That was really fantastic, and I'm pro your pitch for prose. I just want to take this opportunity just to talk a little bit about some of the readers that Nathaniel has featured in his talk tonight. And, you know, we've had a great look at the benefits of decodable readers in these early years, but also that we want these decodable readers to be really interesting and engaging, have controlled text, but also lots of other supportive elements to them, including some really good photography or images in non-fiction, and also great illustrations in fiction, things that students are actually enjoying reading as they are working on their decoding. So we've got a couple of covers up here, which are from our brand new series, ELSA Phonic Readers. And you can see there's a mix of fiction and non-fiction there. And a really great selection. And these titles are for the first 2 years of school. And we might just go to the next slide, Nathaniel. So these books, as I said, it's a brand new series, 91 fiction and non-fiction titles. The books are aligned to the letters and sounds phonic progression, which is the progression that the ELSA teaching program is based on. And they have that before and reading after support. So we've got the introduction before you start the reading of the new sounds and those harder to read and spell words. And then in the back, we've got some comprehension questions. Really important to go through those comprehension questions in the end and use those, because it really highlights if students are understanding what they're reading. So really moving through into that comprehension, bringing it together with the fluency, as we talked about tonight, to get that real experience of reading. For schools that are using the ELSA reading program, the Systematic Synthetic Phonics program, there's a new book for every week of the program and an additional book for every review week, if you're looking to match up readers. So we have a special early adopter offer at the moment for this brand new series, which is exciting. And this is running for all purchases before the end of term 4, 2025. So we've got just over a term and a bit to go on the offer. The special price is for both the foundation and year one pack. And it's a saving of 26% on each of those, which is really wonderful. It's always, I know everyone's always trying to make their budgets work for different resources. So we're really happy to be able to offer this saving until the end of the year. So if you'd like some more information, you can go to oup.com.au/ELSA and you can link out to some information, or our OUP education consultants would love to have a chat to you and talk to you about what you're looking for. So what we might do now is jump over to some questions if we've got any.
There's just one I can answer, which is from Michelle. Right. Yeah, and if there's any others, feel free to send them through. Right. So Michelle's asked, how would you respond to those who argue that paired fluency reading just allows students to practice mistakes? I regularly have a small but vocal group of people push back, as I'm sure you have too, claiming this. I counter this with, what do you think was happening during reading rotations, where only one group of students got to sit with an adult for 10 or 15 minutes? Michelle, you've anticipated what I was going to say with your second half of your response there. But I would definitely say that the other way to think about it is not just it's better than nothing or it's better than the old way, but also that if you set this up really well, you essentially aren't putting them onto decodable practice or paired fluency reading until they actually are ready for that text. So if you've got students that aren't yet decoding or blending CVC words, you may use this time differently with them and do some more single word practice or more grapheme phoneme correspondence practice, for example, because maybe that's where they're at. But when students are ready, the paired fluency, if they're on the right sort of level of challenge text, it's a level 1 or level 2, depending on what they're up to, then this is a really good use of time because being in a pair, it's a more accountable sort of form of practice than, say, independent reading, which you can also do. I think giving them access to independent reading during the day, if you've got time as a wind down activity or it's coming in from recess or lunch, can be lovely. The more time with books, the better, right? But the paired fluency is going to be a really useful practice that allows them to get accountable practice as well, because they're with a pair and they can actually benefit from all of that practice because it's the right level for them. So I would say that eventually the levels don't really matter because everyone becomes moving up to that fluent reading, and eventually over time decoding becomes less of importance than comprehension. But in the early stages, getting practice at that right level of challenge is really important. And yes, to build on Alicia's ideas, when you're suggesting that fluency pairs should be similar levels, is that just focusing on decoding ability? Yes, mainly, I would say. But if you've got students that are speed reading a level and getting the words right, but not really reading for meaning and going too fast, you may want to bring them down a level just to get them back to a regular sort of speed. It's not about as fast as you can. It's about as fast as needed in order to understand what you're reading. So you have to read for meaning, not just for speed. So Alicia, I would say that if you have got some speed readers, maybe bring them down a level and put them in an adjacent pair. But in terms of what they understand from the text, you might have some really strong comprehenders and some low comprehenders, but then they end up being about the same in terms of their decoding ability and their reading as fluently as they can. So I would say that you can still partner them up together, because for decodables, we are really talking about fluency and accuracy, less so than have we got every single comprehension question right, because that might be a completely different one. You might have some opposite where you have really, really poor or some lower sort of fluency readers that are still consolidating that fluency, have lots of little errors, but are actually very strong with comprehension because they don't need a lot of correct input, if you like, to still get the story and piece it all together.
So we've got one from Diana that sort of follows on here, just saying, is it wrong to have top readers paired with mid readers, working down to mid readers with lower readers? Is that not suitable? I think Diana's just wondering, with lower readers, you know, can it be helpful to be paired with someone who's maybe a little bit further ahead? So it'd be interesting to hear what you think on that, Nathaniel.
Yeah, look, it's all dependent on degree. I would say that it's, as long as you've got some level of proficiency with sentence level and word level reading, that students benefit from being on the same sort of text. But if they're not hearing a lot of fluent reading elsewhere, you actually need to engineer that. So paired fluency reading is probably not the best time for someone else to lift them up, mainly because there's quite a lot going on and you can't guarantee how that practice is going. And if one student is dominating and absolutely reading beautifully, but the other one is really slow or finding it difficult, it might be quite an uneven sort of match, and you might get complaints about how difficult the text is. For some it's too easy, for others it's too hard. But that being said, there's other parts in your literacy block where students will benefit from hearing fluent reading, like those choral reading or tracked reading opportunities, as well as practicing the reading skills at the word or the sentence level in the other parts of the program. So it's really important that your phonics program, whatever it is, has lots of time to practice single words, reading and spelling, and also time to read and spell at the sentence level, whether it's sentence dictation or sentence level reading, for example. So I hope that's okay, Diana, in terms of an answer. But I would say that to make this sort of work as a practice, it does have to be fairly similar, the two readers. Otherwise, it becomes a bit disjointed.
And just building on that, Lois has asked during paired reading, would you ever ask the pair to read aloud together?
Mm-hmm. So is that at the same time in synchrony? That practice I haven't actually done. I would be interested to see what happens. I could experiment and have a look next time. I'm in a school tomorrow morning, so I could ask them to do it. But I haven't done that as much, mainly because we do choral reading together as a group, and that the teacher can sort of monitor and hear how students are tracking. When they're doing it in synchrony, it may well be somewhat distracting to stay in sync, because the choral reading, reason it works is because the teacher is tracking along with each word and keeping the group all together. That's why choral reading works, because there's that conductor sort of effect happening that wouldn't necessarily be happening, just thinking it through off the top of my head, with two students reading at the same time. But look, I'm always surprised by different things that I've seen work in different places. So if it works for you, I'd love to hear more, or even see a little video or audio recording. I've noticed we've run out of time. Is there one more question we can answer?
We had a question on just how long do you suggest students are reading a text? And how do you suggest teachers monitor and track the students during the paired reading?
Yeah. I think obviously reading volume is really important, and the decodable text is not the only time that they're learning how to decode. It's like the icing on the cake, where it all sort of comes together, like the performance of a piece that you've been practicing. All the work that you're doing on the drilling of phonics, or the practicing of all of those skills, that's when you're getting your tune up, or your practicing of scales equivalent, just to stay with that orchestral sort of metaphor. So I would say that how long you keep them on the text is depending on how well their reading is progressing in the rest of the program at the single word or sentence level, and that you don't have to think of the text as a gatekeeper that says that you must stay on this text until you have memorized it. Because remember, if they memorize it, they've actually defeated the purpose of doing, fluence practice. You're learning a different thing, which is memorization, rather than variety, which is what we're aiming for. So I would say that if you put them up the next level and they're finding it really hard, you can always bring them back down. But I would say don't be afraid to sometimes give them an extra challenge and see how they go, rather than erring on the side of keep them on the same text, because then you might just get them memorizing it, or might get them demotivated because they don't feel like they're progressing. Sometimes you have to go up in order to come back down again, in order to keep going up, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thank you. If we didn't get to your question, we'll have a look at and get back to you after the webinar. Thanks so much for posting tonight. It's always great to hear from the audience when we're having these sessions. So I'll wrap it up for tonight. Nathaniel, I just wanted to say a huge thank you for the 4 sessions that we've had in this series. It's been really interesting, and I know that all the participants who've been coming along have really enjoyed it. So thank you. Hope you have a good night, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.